Yeah, so we're having a recession right now, and it might surprise you to, by the way, interrupt when you want. If I think it's too good a point or something, I'll say it's off topic and I'll cover it later, which will be, some unforeseen time, which you might as well try me as we go on. The mainstream economics profession for many, many years, and still a goodly proportion of economists, think that, broadly speaking, recessions can't occur. Well, you can have little ones, but if you just leave well enough alone and don't take a government initiative, the thing will go away of its own accord. In other words, much of the profession believes that there's a kind of inherent self-correcting mechanism within a market economy that'll look after things like this. And indeed, the best, sort of most direct writing of this was a fellow named Jean-Baptiste Say, writing a little over 200 years ago. And we now refer to this as a sort of theorem in economics called Say's law. And what it really says is supply creates its own demand. If the output got produced somehow, there will be somebody who wants to buy it all up, or some group of people and firms who want to buy all the stuff up. So it's impossible for having any sort of serious, lasting, insufficient aggregate demand problem, because, as I say, supply somehow creates its own demand. So I want to start by trying to show you the logic, explain to you the logic of Say's law. And then, of course, it became kind of awkward to be a professional economist in the middle of the 1930s, to sit there and teach your students about Say's law, saying you cannot have an insufficient aggregate demand problem when, of course, the unemployment rate was 25% throughout the Western world, and it sure as heck looked like people weren't prepared to buy up all the stuff we could physically produce. And so to say you were an arch believer in Say's law made you look a bit silly in public. So happily there was an economist named John Maynard Keynes who wrote a book that was published halfway through the Depression, in which he tried to give his rationale as to why he believed from an analytical point of view Say's law could be expected to fail sometimes. Now, I don't want to be too hard on poor old Say. There are lots of small recessions that do go away of their own accord. And governments don't have to do major stimulus packages like our governments are doing today. So it's not an outrageous proposition, but it can fail in certain circumstances, like it appeared to fail in the 30s. And the general concern was among governments of the world today is that it was going to fail in the current situation. And so I'm trying to decide whether we got too nervous and gave up on Say's law too quickly in this current event, or whether that was pretty sensible. And to anticipate the bottom line, and to risk you walking out in the next 3 seconds, I will assert that my conclusion is that I think it was prudent to be concerned that Say's law would fail in the current environment. And so I think our governments have done some sensible action. It is not without costs, though. The benefits are that it probably steered off a much worse recession, but it's going to cost us a lot to unwind what the government has set up, in particular the large deficits, which mean rising debt, which we have to do something about getting rid of. The actions that the government will need to take over the next few years to get that deficits and ultimately debt down again. And there's a reason we want to get it down before the baby boom aging phenomenon gets with a vengeance. My irritating generation, it's going to be a big burden to you when we're all retired and needing health care and public pensions and so on. It would be nice if we could be out of debt as a country by then, so that the burden to the then workers looking after the dependent generations, I guess I won't take all the blame. Peter's here, so he's part of the conversation. Sorry?
We'll share the...
Yeah. We're still outnumbered, I'm afraid. So it's not without cost, but I still, if it were my call, I wouldn't have done the details the government did, and I'll talk about the specifics near the end. But I think taking some action as opposed to waiting for the self-correction mechanism was the right thing to do. Anyway, let's go back and try and set up Say's law so at least we can see that it's not an outrageous proposition in the first place. Okay. Now, I think the best way to think of it is to think of a very simple economy. It's got households and firms, no government, no rest of the world, just a simple discussion here. And you've got a situation where the firms are producing a certain amount of stuff, and let's assume they don't retain any earnings. So everything they get in terms of the sales of selling this stuff is sent to the household. Okay, either it's sent as wage payments, because one of the roles of households is to supply labor to the firm, and the rest that isn't, the profits, is sent to the households as well, because another role of households is being the firm owners. Okay, so with no retained earnings, all the sales value gets sent to the households. Okay? Now, the households in aggregate always seem to spend, we say consume, a noticeable proportion of their total income, but they save some of it. So when those dollar bills come floating back to the firms from the households, the consumption spending wanting to buy up the output, we know that if they save at all, the consumption dollars will be a smaller pile of dollars than the value of the goods produced in the first place. So there will be an insufficient aggregate demand problem just by definition almost, right off the top. Now, of course, that gets avoided because the firms buy some of their own output. I don't mean literally each individual firm, but I mean some firms need, the ones whose machines are running out or wearing out that period, they need to replace the computer or whatever, and so they need to buy some other firm's output. In other words, firms sell their goods partly to households and partly to firms. We call the spending by firms on newly produced output that will take the form of new machines and factories and so on as their investment spending. So the challenge for the insufficient aggregate demand problem is that what happens if the amount of investment spending that firms want to do is less than the amount of savings that households want to do? Because what we need to have everything add up is that firms make up for the savings, the fact that consumption is less than total output, by just the right amount of investment. Now, in the old days, when Say was writing, it wasn't such a preposterous idea to assume that those would be one and the same thing, because the firm and the household were like one guy. It's just a single firm entrepreneur. And if he says, well, I think I'll do some more savings today. Well, why would he do that? Because he wants to plow some of his resources into expanding the firm. So by definition, his investment in the operation as a firm runner would go up one for one with savings. So Say thought it was a silly question to say, well, what happens if savings and investment don't balance each other? It's the same guy making those two decisions simultaneously. But of course, in the modern economy, was Keynes' point, was we now have the separation of ownership and control. There are managers of the firms who take the day-to-day operational decisions. And the owners are, yes, ultimately households, but they're not consulted. The shareholders are not consulted on a day-to-day basis on deciding how much to spend on new plant today and so on. So what we have is a completely decentralized, market-oriented economy in which the households don't phone up the firms and say, I think I'll do some more savings today. Is that okay with you guys? They don't do that, right? They just decide to do the extra savings. In particular, if they fear a recession, well, suppose households all just woke up from a nightmare one morning and we were all sitting there fine with investment and savings just balancing, so the economy was replicating itself each period, producing a certain amount of stuff, and firms were all selling exactly that amount of stuff to somebody, and so there was no temptation to lay anybody off. Okay, so then the households wake up from this nightmare saying, in my dream, I feared there was a big recession, and I feared that might actually take place in the real economy. So what's the rational thing to do as an individual? Is to do some more saving. Build up your little nest egg in case this rainy day that you fear does in fact come. And you can see how it's potentially a self-reinforcing proposition, because if the households en masse decide to do a big jump up in their savings and therefore a big cut in their consumption spending, then the firms are losing that hunk of the demand for their stuff. And the firms aren't likely to just say, oh, because people aren't buying my stuff, I think I'll expand the size of my plant and increase my capacity. Why would they raise their investment just to make up for the lost consumption spending? Because this is the very time you don't need the extra capacity, because nobody's buying your stuff for the next while. So it's sort of silly to expect that investment will simply pick up the slack in terms of total demand. So that's the problem. But Say said, well, wait a minute. Let's just track down what these households are going to do with this saving. They're not going to take the income that they used to spend and are now worried and therefore not prepared to spend. They're not going to just put it in the mattress, put those dollar bills sort of under the pillow. They will go to some financial institutions and try and earn a little interest on the stuff, right? So they'll take it, say, they'll either buy a bond or some stocks or put it on deposit at their bank by a GIC. It doesn't matter, it turns out, which financial detail story you tell. I'll talk about a banking story, just so that will be the version of the financial intermediary to connect